Around the year 1300, as the first light of dawn spread across the countryside of medieval Europe, life was already beginning inside the thick stone walls of a castle. Long before the lord of the castle awoke, servants were carrying water from wells, stable hands were feeding horses, cooks were lighting fires beneath great iron cauldrons, and guards who had spent the night watching the walls were changing shifts. Although castles are often remembered as symbols of war and noble power, they were also homes, workplaces, administrative centers, and small communities where dozens, and sometimes hundreds of people lived together every day. Behind the towers, gates, and battlements existed a carefully organized society in which every person had a place, every hour carried responsibilities, and survival depended upon discipline, cooperation, and constant preparation. By the beginning of the 14th century, castles had evolved over several centuries. Many earlier wooden fortifications had been replaced by strong stone structures designed to resist attack and demonstrate the wealth of their owners. Thick curtain walls surrounded courtyards filled with workshops, kitchens, storehouses, chapels, stables, and living quarters. High towers overlooked nearby villages, rivers, forests, and roads, allowing defenders to observe anyone approaching from miles away. Yet despite their military appearance, only a small part of daily life involved preparing for battle. Most days were occupied by routine work that kept the castle functioning as the political and economic heart of the surrounding lands. The lord who owned the castle usually controlled extensive estates beyond its walls. Farmers cultivated fields, raised livestock, and paid rents or services in exchange for protection and the right to work the land. The castle became the place where taxes were collected, disputes were settled, contracts were witnessed, and justice was administered. Messengers frequently arrived carrying letters sealed with wax, while merchants delivered supplies that could not be produced locally. Officials maintained records of rents, harvests, livestock, and obligations, ensuring that the estate remained productive throughout the year. The castle itself was built to balance comfort with defense. Approaching visitors often crossed a wooden bridge spanning a deep ditch or moat before reaching the heavily fortified gatehouse. Massive oak doors reinforced with iron bands could be closed quickly during danger, while a heavy portcullis could be lowered to block entry. Narrow passageways forced visitors to slow down before entering the inner courtyard, where soldiers could easily observe newcomers. Every entrance reflected the understanding that security remained a constant concern, even during peaceful years. Within the outer walls stood numerous buildings, each serving a specific purpose. Stables sheltered valuable horses used for transport, farming, hunting, and warfare. Workshops housed blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, armorers, and other craftsmen whose skills were essential for maintaining both the castle and the surrounding estate. Granaries protected precious stores of grain from moisture and pests, while barns held hay needed to feed animals during winter months. Every available space was carefully planned to support long-term survival. At the center of most castles stood the Great Hall, the largest and most important room in the entire complex. Here the lord and his household gathered for meals, held meetings with tenants and visiting nobles, celebrated religious festivals, and listened to reports from estate officials. Large fireplaces provided warmth during cold seasons, although smoke often lingered beneath the timber roof before escaping through openings high above. Long wooden tables filled the hall during meals, while colorful banners displayed family symbols and reminded everyone present of the noble lineage that ruled the estate. Although the lord occupied the highest position within the household, his authority depended upon the work of many others. The lady of the castle played an equally important role in managing domestic affairs. She supervised servants, oversaw the preparation of food, organized clothing and household supplies, and often managed the estate whenever her husband traveled or served in military campaigns. Noblewomen were also responsible for raising children, arranging marriages, overseeing charitable activities, and ensuring that religious observances remained part of daily life. Their influence extended throughout the household, even if political power formally rested with the Lord. Children born into noble families experienced a carefully structured upbringing. From an early age, they learned the customs expected of their social rank. Young boys practiced reading, writing, riding horses, hunting, and using training weapons. Many eventually left home to serve as pages or squires in another noble household before becoming knights. Girls received instruction in household management, religion, embroidery, music, reading, and the responsibilities they would later assume within noble families. Education emphasized discipline, courtesy, and loyalty alongside practical knowledge needed to manage estates. Far below the noble family in status stood the many servants whose labor sustained castle life. Some cleaned rooms, carried firewood, washed clothing, prepared beds, and emptied waste. Others worked in kitchens, brewed ale, baked bread, or maintained supplies. Stable boys cared for horses throughout the day, while gardeners cultivated herbs, vegetables, and fruit within protected gardens. Laundry workers spent hours washing garments by hand, often using water heated over open fires. Every task required physical effort, and little work remained unfinished for long. The kitchen ranked among the busiest places inside the castle. Before sunrise, cooks prepared fires large enough to roast meat, boil soups, and bake bread for dozens or even hundreds of people. Massive iron pots hung above flames, while spits slowly turned joints of beef, pork, venison, or mutton. Bread formed the foundation of most meals, accompanied by pottage, a thick stew made from grains, vegetables, herbs, and whatever meat or fish happened to be available. The quality of food depended greatly upon social rank. The lord and distinguished guests enjoyed finer cuts of meat, imported spices, fresh fruit, wine, and delicate pastries, while servants received simpler meals consisting mainly of coarse bread, vegetables, cheese, and ale. Food preservation demanded careful planning because fresh supplies could not always be obtained. Salt played a vital role in preserving meat and fish, while smoking and drying extended the life of many foods. Cellars stored barrels filled with ale, wine, salted meat, pickled vegetables, and grain. Honey sweetened dishes before sugar became widely available in Northern Europe, while herbs from castle gardens flavored meals and occasionally served medicinal purposes. Every harvest had to last until the following growing season, making careful storage essential. Water drawn from wells was used for cooking, cleaning, and drinking, although ale was consumed frequently because brewing often made liquids safer to drink than untreated water from uncertain sources. Brewing formed an important part of castle life, with servants producing large quantities of weak ale consumed by nearly everyone, including children. Stronger beverages were reserved for special occasions or higher-ranking members of the household. The daily schedule followed the rhythm of daylight and the ringing of chapel bells. Morning prayers marked the beginning of work, while religious observances divided the day into familiar intervals. Christianity shaped nearly every aspect of castle life. Most castles contained a chapel where priests conducted mass, heard confessions, celebrated marriages, baptized infants, and offered prayers for both the living and the dead. Religious festivals punctuated the calendar, bringing periods of celebration as well as fasting. Saints' feast days, Christmas, Easter, and other holy occasions influenced work schedules, meals, and community gatherings. The castle chapel also reminded residents that spiritual well-being was considered just as important as physical survival. Noble families frequently donated money or land to religious institutions, believing that charitable acts benefited both society and their souls. Priests often advised household members, taught children, copied manuscripts, and cared for the sick using the limited medical knowledge available at the time. Sleeping arrangements reflected the strict hierarchy of medieval society. The lord and his immediate family occupied private chambers located in the strongest and most comfortable sections of the castle, often within the keep. Their rooms might contain carved wooden furniture, decorated tapestries, feather mattresses, and chests filled with clothing and valuables. Even these rooms, however, remained colder and darker than most modern homes. Glass windows were expensive and uncommon. So many openings were covered with wooden shutters or oiled cloth to reduce wind and rain. Servants rarely enjoyed such privacy. Many slept together on simple straw mattresses placed directly on wooden floors or benches inside shared rooms. Others rested wherever space allowed, sometimes close to kitchens or workshops where they worked. Warm blankets, if available, were valuable possessions during long winters. Fireplaces heated only selected rooms, leaving much of the castle cold for large parts of the year. Lighting after sunset depended almost entirely upon candles and oil lamps. Beeswax candles produced cleaner light but remained expensive, making them more common in noble chambers and chapels. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were cheaper but burned with unpleasant odors and more smoke. Because artificial light remained limited, many daily activities ended soon after darkness fell, except for essential duties performed by guards, cooks, and servants responsible for maintaining fires. Despite their impressive appearance, castles were not especially comfortable places to live. Thick stone walls protected against attack but trapped moisture and cold. Smoke from fireplaces lingered indoors, while damp conditions encouraged mold and unpleasant smells. Waste disposal presented constant challenges. Chamber pots were emptied regularly, and latrines built into projecting stone walls allowed waste to fall into pits or moats below. Maintaining cleanliness required continuous effort, although standards differed greatly from those of later centuries. Bathing occurred less frequently than in many earlier civilizations, yet personal cleanliness was not entirely neglected. Wooden tubs allowed occasional bathing when sufficient hot water was available, especially among wealthier households. Washing hands before meals was considered an important sign of good manners, and scented herbs were sometimes used to freshen clothing or living spaces. Linen undergarments could be changed and washed more often than outer garments, helping maintain a basic level of hygiene. Illness remained an unavoidable part of medieval life. Physicians rarely lived permanently within smaller castles, so treatment often depended upon local healers, monks, or household members familiar with traditional remedies. Herbs grown in gardens were prepared into mixtures believed to reduce pain or treat illness. Bloodletting remained a common medical practice because many believed disease resulted from imbalances within the body. Injuries from work, hunting, or military training also required constant attention. Serious epidemics had not yet reached Europe in 1300, but disease, infection, childbirth, and poor nutrition still claimed many lives. Outside in the castle courtyard, activity continued throughout the day. Blacksmiths repaired horseshoes, forged nails, sharpened swords, and maintained farming tools. Carpenters built wagons, repaired doors, and fashioned furniture. Masons inspected stone walls damaged by weather, while laborers transported supplies from nearby villages. The sounds of hammering, sawing, animals, and conversation filled the air from dawn until evening, making the courtyard the busiest part of the castle during ordinary days. The rhythm of work varied according to the season. Spring brought repairs after the hardships of winter and the beginning of planting across the estate. Summer demanded long days supervising harvest preparations, maintaining roads, repairing fences, and collecting hay. Autumn was the busiest season of all, as grain, fruit, vegetables, and livestock had to be gathered, preserved, and stored before cold weather arrived. Winter shifted attention indoors, where tools were repaired, clothing was mended, accounts were reviewed, and supplies were carefully rationed until the next growing season. Every season required planning, because a single poor harvest could threaten the welfare of everyone who depended upon the estate. Although castles projected strength, they relied heavily upon the surrounding countryside. Villages located nearby supplied much of the food, timber, livestock, and labor needed to sustain the household. Farmers cultivated wheat, barley, oats, peas, beans, onions, cabbages, and other crops that filled the castle's granaries and kitchens. Shepherds tended flocks, whose wool became clothing and blankets, while cattle provided milk, cheese, leather, and meat. Pigs foraged in nearby woodlands before being slaughtered and preserved for winter. The prosperity of the castle was inseparable from the success of the people who lived beyond its walls. The relationship between lord and tenant was governed by the customs of the feudal system. In return for access to land and the lord's protection, peasants owed rents, labor services, or portions of their harvest. Estate officials supervised these obligations, ensuring that fields were cultivated and dues collected. Some tenants enjoyed greater freedoms than others, while many remained bound by long-standing customs that limited where they could live or whom they served. The castle therefore represented not only military authority, but also economic and legal power over the surrounding region. Justice was an important function of castle life. The lord, or his appointed steward, regularly held manorial courts, where disputes between tenants were heard and local customs enforced. Arguments over land boundaries, unpaid rents, damaged property, grazing rights, inheritance, or broken agreements were settled before witnesses. Minor crimes often resulted in fines, while more serious offenses could bring imprisonment or harsher punishment according to local law. Written records of these proceedings became increasingly common during the 13th and early 14th centuries, reflecting the growing importance of administration alongside warfare. Messengers arrived frequently, carrying news from neighboring estates, monasteries, royal officials, or distant nobles. Travel remained slow and often dangerous, making reliable communication valuable. Letters were handwritten on parchment, carefully folded, and sealed with wax bearing the sender's personal seal. Upon receiving important correspondence, the lord might gather trusted advisors in the Great Hall to discuss political developments, financial matters, or obligations owed to the crown. Decisions made within the castle could influence not only the household, but also every village connected to the estate. Visitors were a familiar part of castle life. Traveling merchants offered cloth, spices, metal goods, wine, and luxury items unavailable locally. Pilgrims occasionally requested food or shelter while journeying to religious shrines. Knights, clergy, royal officials, and neighboring nobles might arrive without much warning, expecting hospitality appropriate to their rank. Welcoming important guests required careful preparation. Chambers were cleaned, tables were laid with the finest dishes, and kitchens increased production to provide generous meals that reflected the honor and reputation of the household. Hospitality carried great importance in medieval society. Sharing food and drink strengthened political alliances and demonstrated wealth. Banquets featured multiple courses, served in elaborate succession. Roasted meats, freshwater fish, game birds, pies, cheeses, fresh bread, and seasonal fruits appeared alongside imported spices that signaled prosperity. Musicians played harps, flutes, or bagpipes, while entertainers recited stories, performed acrobatics, or sang heroic tales. Such occasions celebrated marriages, military victories, religious festivals, or the arrival of distinguished visitors, but they also reinforced the social order that defined castle life. Entertainment, however, was not limited to grand feasts. Noble households enjoyed hunting, one of the most valued pastimes of the medieval aristocracy. Forests surrounding the estate provided deer, wild boar, rabbits, birds, and other game. Hunting combined recreation with practical training, developing riding skills, weapon handling, and cooperation among participants. Falcons and hawks were carefully trained for falconry, another prestigious activity that required patience and considerable expertise. Successful hunts supplied fresh meat for the castle while displaying the status of those who participated. Inside the Great Hall, evenings sometimes brought music, storytelling, board games, or the recitation of romances celebrating legendary heroes. Professional minstrels traveled from one noble household to another, carrying songs and stories that preserved history, entertained audiences, and reinforced ideals of courage, loyalty, and honor. Chess, introduced to Europe centuries earlier, became increasingly popular among the nobility, valued both as recreation and as an exercise in strategy. For many residents, however, leisure remained limited. Servants, laborers, and craftsmen worked long hours maintaining the castle's daily operations. Bakers rose before dawn, stable hands cared for animals regardless of weather, guards remained alert throughout the night. Laundry workers spent exhausting days washing, drying, and repairing clothing. The smooth functioning of the household depended upon countless tasks that attracted little attention but could not be neglected. Among the castle's permanent residents were soldiers responsible for its defense. Not every castle maintained a large garrison during peaceful times, but a core group of trained men-at-arms usually remained on duty. They patrolled walls, guarded entrances, maintained weapons, and practiced military exercises to preserve their readiness. Spears, swords, crossbows, shields, helmets, and armor required constant maintenance because rust, damaged leather, or weakened wooden shafts could prove disastrous during combat. Training formed a regular part of military life. Knights and squires practiced riding, swordsmanship, lance techniques, and mounted combat. Archers trained with bows or crossbows, improving both strength and accuracy. Mock exercises helped soldiers coordinate movements in preparation for real conflict. Military readiness served not only defensive purposes, but also reinforced the authority of the lord over his lands. Armor represented a substantial investment. Wealthier knights wore mail shirts reinforced with helmets, padded garments, and increasingly sophisticated pieces of plate protection as armor technology advanced during the late 13th and early 14th centuries. Maintaining such equipment required skilled armorers capable of repairing damaged rings, replacing straps, and polishing metal surfaces. Horses trained for warfare also demanded specialized care, receiving quality feed and careful grooming throughout the year. Castles were designed with defense constantly in mind. Watchmen occupied towers overlooking roads and rivers, scanning the horizon for unusual movement. Signal fires or horns could warn nearby settlements if danger approached. Stores of grain, salted meat, dried peas, beans, and fresh water allowed the household to endure prolonged sieges if necessary. Wells located within the walls ensured that defenders retained access to water even if enemies surrounded the castle. Should an attack occur, every resident had responsibilities. Soldiers defended walls and gatehouses, while servants transported arrows, stones, water, and food to fighting positions. Blacksmiths repaired damaged equipment, cooks prepared meals under difficult conditions, and priests offered prayers to encourage defenders. Women frequently assisted by carrying supplies, treating wounded soldiers, or helping organize essential work within the household. Successful defense depended upon cooperation rather than military strength alone. Fortunately, long sieges remained relatively uncommon for many castles. Most years passed without major military action, allowing attention to remain focused on estate management rather than warfare. Nevertheless, the possibility of conflict influenced nearly every aspect of castle design and organization. Thick walls, narrow windows, fortified towers, and carefully controlled entrances reflected generations of experience gained through earlier conflicts. Fire represented another constant danger. Although many castles were constructed from stone, roofs, floors, doors, furniture, and interior walls often contained large amounts of timber. Kitchens, workshops, candles, and fireplaces all increased the risk of accidental fires spreading rapidly. Buckets of water were kept nearby, and servants remained vigilant whenever open flames were in use. A serious fire could destroy valuable supplies or render important buildings unusable for months. Animals formed an essential part of everyday castle life. Horses occupied the highest position because transportation, communication, agriculture, hunting, and warfare all depended upon them. Dogs assisted during hunts and guarded property, while cats helped control rats and mice that threatened food supplies. Chickens provided eggs, geese supplied feathers and meat, and pigeons nested within specially constructed dovecotes, offering an additional source of food. Livestock within or near the castle ensured a steady supply of essential resources. Clothing reflected both practical needs and social status. Noble men and women wore garments made from fine wool, linen, silk, or imported fabrics when available. Bright colors, expensive dyes, embroidered decoration, belts, jewelry, and fur trim displayed wealth and position. Servants and laborers wore simpler clothing made from coarse wool and linen, designed for durability rather than appearance. During colder months, heavy cloaks and layered garments helped protect against damp winds that easily penetrated stone buildings. Textile production occupied many hours within the household. Women spun wool into thread, wove cloth, repaired worn garments, and produced blankets or tapestries. Embroidery decorated clothing and religious objects while demonstrating skill and refinement. Large tapestries hanging upon castle walls served not only as decoration but also provided modest insulation against cold stone surfaces. Books remained rare and valuable possessions. Noble families sometimes owned handwritten manuscripts containing religious texts, histories, legal documents, or works of literature. Reading was generally limited to educated members of the household and clergy, although literacy gradually became more widespread among administrators responsible for managing estates. Scribes carefully copied documents by hand, preserving records essential for governance and inheritance. The education of young nobles extended beyond reading and writing. Boys learned the responsibilities expected of future landowners and military leaders. They observed estate administration, accompanied experienced knights, and practiced courtesy during meals and formal gatherings. Girls studied household organization, hospitality, religious devotion, and financial management, preparing them to oversee large households of their own after marriage. In both cases, practical experience often proved as important as formal instruction. Marriage among noble families rarely concerned personal preference alone. Alliances strengthened political relationships, secured property, and ensured legitimate heirs. Weddings held within the castle chapel or great hall brought together neighboring families whose interests extended well beyond the ceremony itself. Celebrations often lasted several days, featuring generous feasts, music, and gifts that reflected the significance of the union. Death was an ever-present reality within medieval society. High infant mortality, recurring illness, accidents, and the hazards of childbirth affected every social class. Funeral processions moved solemnly from the castle to nearby churches or monasteries, where prayers were offered for the deceased. Noble families frequently commissioned elaborate tombs, while simpler burials marked the passing of servants and laborers whose contributions nevertheless sustained the life of the household.